Some dogs don't just follow their owners. Sometimes, they lead them back to something the world tried to forget. The rain had been falling for hours, slow and steady, soaking the earth until the ground behind Caleb Turner's cabin turned soft and dark like something half awake beneath the surface. And yet Shadow hadn't stopped digging. Not once. Not even when the mud clung thick to his paws, or when the cold night air pressed heavy against the silence of the hills. Because for 3 days now the dog had returned to the exact same spot just beyond the broken fence line, just past an old oak stump that looked like it had died standing. And every time Caleb called him back, every time he whistled low and steady the way he used to back when commands meant something, Shadow only paused for a moment, ears lifted, head slightly tilted as if listening to something far deeper than sound, before turning back and digging again, slower now, more deliberate, like he wasn't searching anymore, but uncovering something he already knew was there. And Caleb stood on the porch watching it all unfold with the kind of quiet unease he hadn't felt in years, not since the war, not since those long nights where silence meant you were either safe or seconds away from something breaking through it. Because there was a pattern to this, something that didn't belong to instinct or habit, something that felt almost intentional, and the land itself didn't help ease that feeling. Because this place, the one he had bought for next to nothing just 2 weeks ago, carried a kind of stillness that pressed in on you if you stayed too long. The kind of stillness that made even the wind feel like it was holding its breath. And folks in the nearest town, 10 miles down a narrow road that twisted through pine and rock, had warned him in that careful, polite way people did when they didn't want to sound foolish but still felt the need to say something. That the land had a history, that things had happened out here a long time ago, things no one ever really explained. And Caleb had nodded the same way he always did, half listening, because he wasn't looking for stories or ghosts or anything that required belief. He was just looking for a place quiet enough to let the past fade on its own. But now, standing there in the rain with Shadow's steady digging cutting through the silence like a heartbeat he couldn't ignore, he felt that old instinct creeping back in. The one that told him when something wasn't right, when something beneath the surface was waiting. And then it happened again, a faint sound barely louder than the rain itself. A dull metallic tap echoing up through the wet soil as Shadow's paw struck something solid, and the dog froze, completely still, his body tense but not afraid, his ears sharp and forward, and slowly, almost carefully, he stepped back from the hole and looked at Caleb, not with confusion, not with excitement, but with a kind of quiet certainty that settled deep in the space between them, as if to say that whatever lay beneath that ground had been waiting, not for just anyone, but for them to find it. Caleb did not move right away, because there was something in the way Shadow stood there that held him in place, something quiet but certain that pressed deeper than curiosity. And for a moment, he simply watched the rain ripple across the half-dug patch of earth, listening as the soft patter settled into a rhythm that almost masked the faint metallic echo still lingering in his ears. And then he stepped forward, slow and deliberate, boots sinking slightly into the wet ground as he approached the hole, his breath steady but his thoughts shifting, because that sound had not come from rock or root or anything natural he could name. And when he knelt beside the opening, brushing aside loose soil with his gloved hand, he felt it immediately, a smooth, cold surface hidden just beneath the mud, something flat and solid that did not belong to the forest. And Shadow lowered himself beside him, not digging now, not moving at all, only watching with those sharp amber eyes that seemed to follow every motion as if he had already seen what Caleb had yet to uncover. And carefully, with the same patience he had learned long ago when rushing meant mistakes, Caleb cleared more of the dirt away, revealing the edge of a metal plate, weathered but intact, its surface marked by faint lines that might have once been letters or symbols worn thin by time. And he paused again, hand resting against it, feeling not just the cold of the metal, but a strange steadiness beneath it, as if whatever lay below had been sealed away with intention, not forgotten but hidden. And the thought settled heavy in his chest because nothing about this felt accidental, not the placement, not the depth, not even the way Shadow had found it. And the rain began to lighten, the steady fall easing into a soft mist that drifted through the trees like something alive. And in that quiet shift Caleb became aware of another sound, subtle but unmistakable, a low, distant vibration that seemed to travel up through the ground and into his palm, so faint he might have dismissed it on any other day. But now it felt connected, part of the same hidden rhythm Shadow had been listening to all along. And he drew his hand back slowly, eyes narrowing as he studied the plate more closely, noticing along its edge a narrow seam, just enough space to suggest it was not a fixed part of the earth, but something meant to be opened. And yet there was no handle, no obvious way in, only that thin line tracing a boundary between what was seen and what remained buried. And he sat back on his heels, glancing toward the cabin for a moment, as if weighing the choice between leaving it alone or stepping further into whatever this was. But the decision had already begun to form before he even stood, because some part of him, the same part that had once followed orders without hesitation, recognized the feeling now as something else entirely, not command but calling, and Shadow rose with him, shaking the rain from his coat before stepping closer to the edge of the hole, his nose hovering just above the exposed metal, as if confirming what Caleb had already begun to understand, that this was not the end of the digging but only the beginning, and somewhere beyond the trees, the wind shifted just enough to carry a faint, hollow tone through the air, like a distant echo moving through something unseen, and Caleb turned back toward the ground, the quiet weight of the moment settling fully into place as he realized that whatever had been buried here had not been lost to time. It had been waiting, and now it was no longer alone. Caleb returned to the cabin only long enough to gather what he needed, moving with a quiet focus that felt almost automatic, as if some part of him had already accepted that there was no turning away from what had begun. And when he stepped back outside, the air had shifted, the rain now reduced to a fine mist that clung to the trees and softened the edges of the world, making everything feel slightly distant, slightly unreal. And Shadow waited exactly where he had been, sitting beside the half-exposed metal plate with a stillness that was not patience but purpose, his gaze fixed on the ground, as though he could sense something moving far below the surface, something slow and steady that had nothing to do with the weather or the land itself. And Caleb set his tools down beside the hole, a small pry bar and a flashlight worn smooth from years of use, and he crouched again, brushing away the last of the loose dirt until the outline of the plate became clear, a rectangle just wide enough for a man to pass through if it opened the way he suspected, and along one edge the narrow seam caught the faint light, revealing a slight gap that had been hidden beneath layers of soil and time. And he slid the edge of the bar into that space carefully, testing it, feeling the resistance as the metal met something beneath. And for a moment he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because whatever this was had remained sealed for a reason, and opening it meant stepping into something unknown, something that might reach deeper than the quiet life he had tried to build here. And Shadow shifted then, rising slowly and stepping closer, his nose hovering inches above the plate before he let out a low, steady breath, not a growl, not a warning, but something that sounded almost like recognition. And Caleb exhaled softly in return, nodding once as if acknowledging a silent agreement. And then he applied pressure to the bar, slow and controlled, until a faint creak broke through the stillness, a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should, as though it had been waiting years to be heard again. And the plate lifted just enough for a thin line of darkness to appear beneath it, deeper than Shadow, deeper than the fading light of the evening sky, and a cool draft rose from the opening, carrying with it a scent that did not belong to the forest, something dry and still, untouched by wind or rain. And Caleb paused again, listening, because beneath the quiet he could feel it more clearly now, that same subtle vibration he had noticed before, steady and distant, like a pulse measured not in seconds, but in something older, something that did not rush or falter. And Shadow leaned forward, placing one paw gently on the edge of the plate as if marking the threshold, his ears forward, his body calm but alert. And Caleb adjusted his grip, lifting the metal further until it shifted aside with a slow, deliberate motion, revealing the opening fully, a narrow descent carved into the earth with precision that spoke of intention rather than chance. And he angled the flashlight downward, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal the first few feet of a ladder built into the wall, metal rungs descending into a space that seemed to swallow the light before it could reach the bottom. And for a moment neither of them moved, man and dog standing at the edge of something hidden long before either of them had arrived. And Caleb felt that familiar stillness settle over him again. Not the emptiness he had once carried, but something different, something that felt like standing at the edge of a story he had not known was his. And when he finally stepped forward, lowering himself toward the opening, Shadow followed without hesitation, as if this path had always been theirs to take. The metal rungs were colder than Caleb expected, each step carrying a faint echo that rose through the narrow shaft as he descended, the sound stretching longer than it should, as if the space below was wider than the opening suggested, and the beam of his flashlight cut a thin path through the darkness, revealing walls reinforced with aged steel and concrete, not crude or unfinished, but carefully built with a purpose that had endured far beyond its time. And Shadow moved just ahead of him, placing each paw with deliberate care, his body low and steady as though he had done this before in another place, another life. And Caleb followed close behind, one hand gripping the ladder while the other held the light, his breath slow and controlled as the air grew cooler with every step, carrying that same dry stillness that felt untouched by the outside world. And when his boots finally reached solid ground, the sound shifted, no longer hollow but grounded, absorbed by the space around him. And he stepped forward slowly, sweeping the light across the room to reveal something that made him pause. Because this was not just a hidden chamber or a forgotten storage space. It was a room built with intention, with walls lined in shelves and surfaces that held objects arranged in a way that suggested they had once been used, studied, perhaps even depended upon. And though dust had settled over everything in a thin, undisturbed layer, there was no sense of decay or collapse, only a quiet preservation, as if time itself had moved differently down here. And Shadow moved ahead into the room, his nose low, tracing invisible paths along the floor before stopping near the far wall where a long table stood, its surface covered with papers that had yellowed with age but remained intact, held down by small metal weights that kept them from shifting. And Caleb approached carefully, brushing one aside to reveal markings that caught his attention immediately, lines and shapes drawn with precision, not random but deliberate, forming patterns that resembled maps or diagrams. And he leaned closer, the light steady in his hand as he studied them, recognizing just enough to know that this was not ordinary work, not something meant for casual record. And then he felt it again, that subtle vibration beneath his feet, stronger now, more defined, a steady pulse that seemed to move through the structure itself rather than beneath it. And Shadow lifted his head at the same moment, ears forward, body still, as if they were both listening to the same unseen rhythm. And Caleb turned slowly, following the direction of the sound until the beam of his flashlight settled on a section of the wall that looked no different at first glance, smooth and reinforced like the rest, but something about it felt slightly off, a faint seam running along its edge, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. And he stepped closer, reaching out to run his hand along the surface, feeling the subtle shift where metal met metal, and the realization came quietly, settling into place without urgency, but with certainty, that this room was not the end of what had been hidden here. It was only the beginning, and whatever lay beyond that wall was still active in some way, still connected to the pulse that had drawn Shadow to dig in the first place. And for a moment Caleb stood there in the stillness, the weight of the discovery pressing in around him, not overwhelming but undeniable, as if he had stepped into something that had been waiting not just to be found, but to be continued. Caleb did not rush toward the wall, because something about the steady pulse beneath his feet demanded patience rather than force, and he had learned long ago that not every door was meant to be opened quickly. So instead he stepped back slightly, letting the beam of his flashlight trace the edges of the hidden seam again, slower this time, more deliberate, searching for anything that might explain how it had been used before. And Shadow moved closer to the base of the wall, lowering his head, until his nose nearly touched the floor, then shifting slightly to the left, pausing, and shifting again as if mapping something unseen. And Caleb watched him carefully, recognizing that same pattern from years ago when the dog would track faint signals buried beneath debris or soil, not reacting to what was obvious but to what lingered just beyond human perception. And after a moment Shadow stopped completely, placing one paw firmly against a narrow section near the bottom corner of the wall. his ears forward, his body still, and Caleb followed his cue, kneeling beside him and running his hand along the spot until he felt it. A small indentation barely noticeable against the smooth metal surface, worn down by time, but still distinct enough to suggest it had once been pressed or turned, and he hesitated only briefly before placing his fingers against it, applying gentle pressure at first, then more steadily, until there was a faint click that seemed to travel through the wall rather than from it. And the vibration beneath the floor shifted, not stronger but clearer, like a signal that had just been acknowledged, and slowly, almost silently, the seam along the wall widened by a fraction of an inch, revealing a thin line of darkness that did not reflect the light the way the rest of the room did. And Caleb drew in a quiet breath, his focus narrowing as the realization settled deeper, that whatever mechanism had been built here was still functional, still responsive, even after all this time. And the wall began to move, not outward but sideways, sliding just enough to reveal a narrow passage beyond, one that extended further into the earth with a precision that matched everything else he had seen so far, and a faint glow pulsed from somewhere deeper within, not bright enough to illuminate the space but steady enough to be seen, rising and fading in a rhythm that matched the vibration beneath his feet. And Shadow stepped forward without hesitation, crossing the threshold as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, his body calm but alert, and Caleb followed, ducking slightly as he entered the passage, the air shifting again as the space grew tighter, more enclosed, the walls closer on either side. And as he moved forward, the sound changed, no longer just a distant pulse but something more layered, a combination of low resonance and subtle mechanical movement that suggested activity rather than stillness. And after several steps, the passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the first but far more focused, with a single structure at its center, a cylindrical unit built into the floor, its surface lined with faint markings that caught the light in irregular patterns, and at its core a soft glow pulsed steadily, rising and falling in that same measured rhythm. And Caleb stopped just inside the room, the weight of the discovery settling fully around him, not as fear or confusion but as a quiet understanding that this place had not been abandoned in the way most forgotten things were. It had been left behind with purpose, and somehow, without knowing why, he had been brought here to find it. Caleb did not step closer to the structure right away, because something about the steady glow at its core held him at a distance, not out of fear but out of respect, the same quiet instinct that told him when a space carried more than what could be seen. And Shadow circled it slowly, his movements measured and calm, nose tracing the air rather than the surface, as if whatever this was could not be understood by scent alone. And the pulsing light continued its rhythm, rising and falling every few seconds, steady and precise, casting faint reflections along the curved metal walls that seemed to shift like breath in the dim chamber. And Caleb moved forward one step at a time, his boots making almost no sound against the smooth floor as he approached the center, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the markings etched into the cylinder, thin lines and symbols arranged in patterns that felt familiar in a way he could not immediately place, not because he had seen them before but because they carried the same sense of order and intention he had once relied on, systems built to last, to communicate without words. And he reached out slowly, stopping just short of the surface as the glow brightened for a moment, as if reacting to his presence, and the vibration beneath his feet shifted again, not stronger but more aligned, matching the rhythm of his own breathing in a way that felt almost impossible to ignore. And Shadow stopped moving, standing beside him now, his body relaxed but attentive, ears forward, gaze fixed on the center of the structure as though he understood something Caleb did not yet fully see. And for a moment the room fell into a deeper stillness, the kind that did not come from silence but from balance, as if everything within that space had settled into place. And then Caleb noticed something along the base of the cylinder, a narrow panel slightly recessed into the metal, its edges worn just enough to suggest it had been opened before, and he knelt down carefully, brushing his fingers across its surface until he found a small latch, barely visible but still intact. And when he pressed it, the panel released with a soft click, revealing a compartment inside that held a single object, protected from the years by the sealed environment. And he lifted it gently, turning it in the light to reveal a small metal case, no larger than his hand. Its surface marked with the same etched patterns that covered the cylinder, and when he opened it, the glow from the center of the room seemed to reflect off what lay inside. A thin set of documents and a folded photograph, preserved in a way that made them feel untouched by time. And Caleb hesitated before unfolding the photograph, his fingers steady but slow, and when he finally looked at it, the air seemed to shift around him, not dramatically, but enough to settle something deep within his chest. Because the image showed a man standing in front of this very structure, younger but unmistakable. His posture familiar in a way that went beyond resemblance, and beside him stood a German shepherd, alert and steady, its stance nearly identical to Shadow's, and Caleb remained still for a long moment, the quiet weight of recognition settling over him as the steady pulse of the chamber continued around them, not louder, not urgent, just present, as if confirming something that had been set in motion long before he ever arrived. And Shadow stepped closer, lowering his head slightly as if acknowledging the photograph, then lifting his gaze back to Caleb with that same calm certainty, as though the journey that had brought them here was not coincidence, but continuation. And for the first time since he had uncovered the hidden entrance, Caleb understood that this place was not just a discovery. It was a message, one that had been waiting patiently beneath the earth for someone who would know how to listen. Caleb did not look away from the photograph immediately, because something about the man's posture, the way he stood beside the structure with a quiet steadiness, felt less like a coincidence and more like a reflection of something Caleb himself had carried without ever naming, and as he studied the details more closely, he noticed the small insignia on the man's jacket, faint but still visible, the kind of mark that belonged to a unit rather than a place, and it stirred a memory not fully formed but close enough to recognize, like a name heard long ago and almost forgotten. And he turned the photograph over slowly, his fingers careful against the worn edges, revealing a short line of handwriting pressed into the paper with deliberate force, not rushed, not casual, but meant to last. And though the ink had faded slightly with time, the words were still clear enough to read. For the one who listens, not just hears. And Caleb felt the meaning settle deeper than the words themselves, not as a message left for anyone, but as something directed, something intentional. And Shadow shifted beside him, letting out a low breath as he stepped closer to the cylinder, his attention returning to the steady pulse of light that continued without interruption, and Caleb followed, his gaze tucking the photograph carefully back into the case before rising to his feet, the quiet weight of what he had found beginning to connect with everything around him, the structure, the hidden passage, the land above, all part of something designed not just to be hidden, but to be discovered by the right presence. And he approached the cylinder again, this time with a clearer sense of purpose, his eyes tracing the etched patterns across its surface until he noticed a section that mirrored the markings on the case he still held in his hand, subtle but precise, as if both pieces had been made to align. And he brought the case forward slowly, holding it near the matching symbols, and as it drew closer, the pulsing light shifted, not brighter but sharper, more defined, as if focusing, and the vibration beneath his feet responded in kind, tightening into a rhythm that felt less distant now, more immediate, like something waiting for a final step. And Caleb hesitated only for a moment before placing the case against the marked section, and the effect was immediate, a soft resonance passing through the chamber as the surface of the cylinder adjusted slightly, the markings aligning with the case as if completing a pattern that had been left unfinished. And Shadow remained still beside him, his presence calm but grounded, as though anchoring the moment, and a narrow panel along the upper section of the structure opened with a smooth, controlled motion, revealing a small compartment within that emitted a warmer light, softer but steady, and inside rested a compact device, simple in form but clearly designed with intention, its surface marked with the same precise lines that had guided everything else they had uncovered. And Caleb reached for it carefully, lifting it into his hand, feeling its weight, its balance. And as he did, the pulsing light of the chamber shifted once more, not fading but expanding slightly, as if acknowledging the transfer. And for a moment the room seemed to settle into a new stillness, one that felt complete rather than suspended. And Caleb stood there with the device in his hand, the photograph secured, the dog at his side, and understood that whatever had been hidden here had not only been found, it had been passed on, not with noise or spectacle, but with the same quiet certainty that had guided Shadow to dig in the first place. And as the steady pulse continued around them, no longer distant but present, Caleb realized that he had not just uncovered something buried beneath the earth, he had stepped into something that had been waiting for him to arrive. Caleb held the device in his hand a moment longer, feeling the quiet weight of it settle into his palm as the chamber around him shifted into a deeper stillness. The steady pulse now softer but more complete, as if something that had been waiting had finally reached its intended place, and Shadow stepped closer, brushing lightly against Caleb's leg before moving toward the edge of the room. Not restless, not urgent, but ready. The same way he had been at every turn since the first day he began digging, and Caleb glanced once more at the structure, at the faint glow that continued within it, no longer calling but simply existing, like a heartbeat that had found its rhythm again, and without needing to say anything he understood that there was nothing more to take from this space, nothing more to uncover, only something to carry forward, and he turned toward the narrow passage, moving slowly at first, the device secure in his grip, the photograph tucked safely away, and Shadow walked beside him as they retraced their steps, the sound of their movement echoing softly along the walls as they moved through the passage and back into the larger chamber, where the shelves and scattered documents now felt different, no longer just remnants of something hidden, but pieces of a story that had already been completed, and Caleb paused briefly at the base of the ladder, looking back one last time, not out of hesitation but acknowledgement, a silent understanding that this place had served its purpose, and then he began the climb, each step carrying him upward through the narrow shaft until the cool night air met him again, fresh and alive, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine that felt sharper now, clearer, as if the world above had been waiting just as patiently. And when he stepped out onto the ground, the mist had lifted, leaving the sky open and still, the faint outline of stars beginning to show through the clouds, and Shadow emerged behind him, shaking the last traces of dirt from his coat before standing still, his gaze scanning the quiet clearing not with alertness but with calm, as if confirming that everything had settled into place. And Caleb moved a few steps away from the opening, turning back to look at the disturbed earth, the hidden entrance now partially visible in the dim light, and for a moment he considered covering it again, restoring the surface to what it had been before, but something in him told him that it was not meant to be hidden in the same way anymore, not forgotten, not sealed away, only left as it was, waiting if it ever needed to be found again, and he exhaled slowly, the weight of the past few hours settling into something quieter, something steadier, and he looked down at the device in his hand. Its surface faintly warm now, the markings along its edge catching the soft light in a way that felt less like reflection and more like memory, and he realized then that whatever this was, whatever purpose it had once served, it was no longer just part of the place beneath the ground. It was part of him now, something he would carry whether he fully understood it or not. And Shadow stepped forward, nudging his hand gently as if to remind him that the path ahead still mattered, and Caleb gave a small nod, not to the dog but to the quiet understanding that had formed between them, and together they turned toward the cabin, walking back through the damp grass as the night settled around them, not heavy or uncertain, but calm in a way that felt earned, as if the land itself had exhaled after holding something in for far too long. And for the first time since he arrived, Caleb did not feel like a man passing through. He felt like someone who had been meant to stay. Morning came slowly over the hills, not with noise or urgency, but with a quiet light that filtered through the trees and settled gently across the cabin and the land beyond it. And Caleb stood just outside the doorway with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, watching the place where the ground had been disturbed, where the hidden entrance still lay uncovered beneath the fading traces of last night's rain, and Shadow rested nearby, stretched out on the damp grass, his breathing calm and steady. The same quiet presence that had guided everything without ever needing to explain it. And for a long moment Caleb said nothing, did nothing, simply stood there and let the stillness settle around him. Because something had changed, not in the land, not in the air, but in the way he felt within it, as if the weight he had carried for years had shifted just enough to let something else take its place, something steadier, something that did not need to be understood all at once, and he glanced down at the device resting on the small wooden table beside the door, its surface catching the early light in a way that felt less like reflection and more like quiet acknowledgement, as if it had become part of the rhythm of this place. And he stepped closer, running his fingers lightly along its edge, not searching for answers anymore, but simply recognizing its presence. And behind him the door creaked softly as the morning breeze moved through the cabin, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth that felt sharper now, more alive. And he thought about the photograph again, about the man who had stood in that same hidden chamber years before, about the words left behind not as instruction but as a reminder. And he understood now that whatever had been built beneath this land had never been meant to stay buried forever. It had been meant to wait, to endure, until someone came who would not rush past it, who would not ignore what could not be easily explained. And Shadow lifted his head then, looking toward Caleb with those steady amber eyes. And there was no urgency in that gaze, no command, only a quiet confirmation that everything that needed to happen already had. And Caleb gave a small nod, almost without realizing it, as if answering a question that had never been spoken aloud. And he picked up the device once more, holding it with a calm certainty that had not been there before. And then he stepped out into the open clearing, the morning light stretching across the hills as the mist finally lifted, revealing a horizon that felt wider than it had the day before. And he did not feel the need to leave, did not feel the pull to keep moving the way he always had, because for the first time in a long while, the road ahead did not feel like something he had to chase. It felt like something that would meet him where he stood. And Shadow rose to his feet and moved beside him, shoulder brushing lightly against his leg, not leading now, not searching, only staying. And together they stood there in the quiet morning, the land breathing slowly around them, holding its secrets not as burdens, but as reminders that some things are never truly lost, only waiting for the right moment, the right presence, the right kind of listening. And Caleb exhaled softly, the sound barely more than a whisper against the wind, as he looked out across the place he had almost passed by, and understood in a way that did not need words that he had not been looking for anything when he arrived. But something had been waiting for him all the same. And sometimes the world does not reveal its hidden things to the ones who search the hardest, but to the ones who are willing to stay long enough to hear what has been quietly calling